welcome back to my channel and happy reading. If you're new here, my name is Kayla, and if you're not new, thanks for coming back. Always happy to have you. If you're new around here, we like to do a lot of lifestyle and book content. I like to read books and review them and create little TBRs and reading vlogs and lifestyle vlogs. So if any of that interests you, make sure you hit the subscribe button and stick around. And today we're talking about a middle grade review. Okay, confirmed. Of the 8 books that I've read so far in 2023, and it's February 13th. This is my first middle grade read, and that is Beasts and Beauty Dangerous Tales by Soman Chainani. This is a middle grade illustrated fairy tale collection with a bit of a twist. These tales are dark and kind of creepy versions of the fairy tales we all know and love. Soman Chainani is the author of the School for Good and Evil series, which I really liked, actually. I liked the first book. That's the only one that I read. And I filmed a vlog way back when of his book signing at the bookstore where I used to work, and a review of the School for Good and Evil, which I will leave linked in the cards and in the description box if you're interested in watching. It's an old one, more of a montage style vlog, but I did get to meet Soman, and he signed all of my School for Good and Evil books, which is always a nice thing. I have really been feeling like I needed some good middle grade, some fairy tale fantasy, and I've been in a bit of a reading slump, honestly, since I got back from Puerto Rico like 2 weeks ago. I have not really read anything. This is only my second book for the month of February. And I really picked this because when I tend to get into a reading slump, one thing that helps me get out of them is to read anthologies or collections where I can read for a specific number of pages that are usually a shorter amount and get a full story. So for example, each of these stories was about 30-ish, 40 pages, which we'll get into. But it's the perfect amount if I just wanted to read for a little bit and feel like I finished a whole story. So that's a little tip and trick if you're finding yourself in a reading slump. But let's talk about Beasts and Beauty. So these are Beasts and Beauty Dangerous Tales. So they're not just sweet little happy ending fairy tales. I'll go ahead and give you a little rundown of the fairy tales that they cover in this edition, and then we'll chat about it. We start with Red Riding Hood. We have Snow White, Sleeping Beauty, Rapunzel, Jack and the Beanstalk, Hansel and Gretel, Beauty and the Beast, Swoon, Bluebeard, Cinderella, The Little Mermaid, Rumpelstiltskin, and Peter Pan. I actually read this because I was leading up to a Beauty and the Beast themed cocktail night, which was interesting. But I wanted to kind of get into the fantasy mood, and I thought this was really, really perfect. I really liked these stories. They are unique, twisted retellings of these fairy tales, but I think that Soman added a lot of really cool elements to them. For example, a lot of these tales take on a different like cultural standpoint or a different cultural feature of these different stories. So for example, you're too little. Do you need help? Come here. Auntie Kayla doesn't like it when you climb on the top of her closet. It makes her nervous. Please don't do that because you're so small. I have velvet hangers, and Maple has learned that she can hang on to the top of the velvet hangers and stand on them with her little claws and her little feet, so she gets stuck on top of my clothes. As I was saying, Cinderella takes place in Spain. They talk about the Cinderella character, or this other character who's really the true love of the prince, lives in Malaga. They go to Madrid, different things like that, which I think is really, really cool. And they kind of span the globe. So it's interesting, and I appreciate different fairy tales being presented in different cultures. And I think it's more of like a windows and mirrors things, for especially this book being targeted at middle grade younger kids to see themselves, kids in different cultures to see themselves in classic fairy tales, I think is awesome. For example, the Beauty and the Beast fairy tale, which is my favorite fairy tale, the Belle character was Asian, which I think is really cool. So just getting that cultural diversity throughout these fairy tales is very good. I'll say there was only one fairy tale that I was not previously familiar with, and that was Bluebeard, and that was one of my favorite ones, suspiciously. I totally thought Bluebeard was a pirate, but that was not the case, I don't think. These tales follow the same basic structure, but some details are changed that feel like it completely evolves the story into a different one. Our endings are largely the same. The only one that was different was Beauty and the Beast, which had kind of a bittersweet ending, even though it was still my favorite fairy tale in this collection. I love Beauty and the Beast. I love the movie. I love the book. I love the story. I love the fairy tale. Beauty and the Beast, it signed me up. The Belle character actually ends up alone, having killed her lover by accident. I think these also just had a very cool representation of backgrounds and different experiences, and I talked about this a lot in Big Boned, my review of Big Boned recently, and I really loved it. There were some characters that were princes interested in princes and other princesses and all of the above. Like, there were just different representations and experiences, and everything was normalized, which I love. It just was how it existed in this kingdom. I'm trying to think of a specific example, but I felt like there were a lot of kind of thought-provoking or like hot takes woven into these collections and these stories, just kind of like subtly woven in, and like young girls standing up for themselves and things like that, which I definitely appreciated throughout all of these stories, basically, except for with I think one of them. The younger character kind of takes their own charge and takes their story into their own hands, and is the one that kind of stands up for themselves, and sometimes not in the way that parallels with the original fairy tale. One kind of downside to this collection for me was I felt like some of these stories were pretty short, and I know I just said that a lot of them were on average 40 pages, but it's not like it's a full page text. For example, those margins are huge. That font is huge. There's not a lot of text on each of these pages, which, especially for middle grade readers, I think is pretty nice. Makes it a little bit more manageable for them. And a lot of these pages are at least partially illustrated, if not full color illustrations. For example, this is the end of the Beauty and the Beast chapter, so don't spoil it for yourself. But we have these color illustrations. So your actual like writing or text of these stories is probably somewhere closer to like 25 pages. And there were some that I was like, oh, you have set up such a cool world. I want to dive in deeper. And that's always the struggle I have with anthologies and collections like this, is they set me up and they get me excited, but I should just know that it's going to be a short version of a story, but I want more. There were some in this though that I think were exceptionally short, and he definitely could have given us more. For example, I just read it today. Little Mermaid was 16 pages long. In that story, we already start in the Sea Witch's cave, and by the end, they're just kind of like talking about what it means to like find love and actually be in love with somebody, which is important to talk about. Miss Ariel girl, you did not know his name or anything about him, and you were ready to disavow your whole family and join the world of the humans and give up your fins for this man you barely met. But daddy, I love him. No, the Sea Witch tells it how it is in this story, but by the end it's like, all right, let's talk about payment. What do you want for your legs? And I'm like, and then I know it's over within 16 pages. That's it. We don't see any action. We don't see a prince. Soman, you forgot half the story, my dude. So some of them I was just like, we could tell a little bit more. There's a little bit more we could talk about here. Overall though, this was a good quick read. Obviously it's targeted for a much younger audience than me, which made it a bit of an easy read. Like I said, big margins, big font, colored illustrations, but in all it's probably took me about 2 hours to read of all of my reading time. I just read it over a series of days, but I loved this kind of like dark and twisted version of tales. I think we think of fairy tales and they're all butterflies and rainbows, but there's actually a lot of darkness in original fairy tales, and I think it's important to show that your happy ending doesn't just show up for you. You have to work for it or earn it or do something to make that happy ending happen, which I think Soman did throughout these fairy tales. Not really anybody just gets their happy fairy tale ending. Some characters don't get a happy ending. Some of these versions I actually liked better than the original. For example, Red Riding Hood was a really strong open for this collection. In Red Riding Hood, in that tale, in the land that we're in, every spring, on the first day of spring, the most beautiful girl in the kingdom is sacrificed to the wolves. It culminates in this girl outsmarting all these wolves and then creating a community of girls that were kind of would have been sacrificed to the wolves, or which was really cool. And the Peter Pan tale, it was such a strong ending note. That was the last tale in this collection. So we start and end with two fantastic versions of these fairy tales. Basically, in the Peter Pan version, Wendy realizes that Peter is just never gonna grow up. Like, he is just, nope, he is never gonna love her the way that she so hopes that Peter will eventually come to love her. But instead, she falls in love with a pirate from Captain Hook's brigade and falls in love with him, and we see Wendy grow up and eventually have a baby that's supposed to be destined to live in Neverland. And that kind of like heart-wrenchingness of like having to live in the regular world, the grown-up world. Wendy finally grows up and separates from Neverland, but part of her heart and her soul, her baby, needs to live in Neverland with her love, this pirate. It was just like, it got deep, man. I was like, I might be crying here at this Peter Pan retelling. I think they're really going to make kids think when you read them, or make adults think about these fairy tales. It made me want to read the classics. I wish I had one of my many editions of Grimm's fairy tales, but I alas do not. A lot of books like this, middle grade and YA, I do think about and frame in the context of teaching them with kids. It's just kind of, for a while, for probably like 3 years of my life, I was reading books and vetting them to put in my classroom library or to teach with my kids. So I still kind of fall into that habit, especially with middle grade. And this book I would have loved to teach with my students. Definitely for comparative literature purposes, I think this would have been a very, very cool text to use. I actually did something similar with Leigh Bardugo's The Language of Thorns, which was kind of a collection of mythology and folk tales from the Grishaverse. I would have used this to compare with traditional Grimm's fairy tales to talk about how they're different and maybe which is better and why, or what students would have liked or preferred, the difference in theme between the two versions. The possibilities are endless. But I definitely liked that in this version, especially the female characters were just like a little bit more bold and a little bit more badass, took their futures into their own hands, which I appreciated. It did, especially for the ones that I hadn't read. Like, I've never read the traditional version of Jack and the Beanstalk or Bluebeard or Rumpelstiltskin. It made me want to go read those original fairy tales, and I think that's a great way to bring kids in and then move them on to a classic, more difficult form of literature, because sometimes the language in the original versions can be a bit challenging. I think this is a great way to introduce them to the story and then let them move on to a more elevated text. I also did appreciate that the end of this book does have the first chapter from the first School for Good and Evil book. So it's a great segue if kids are liking these kinds of stories to go to another twist or retelling of fairy tales, which is what School for Good and Evil is, just in series form. And I did talk about this with my friend Leo. There were definitely some places where this could be just like a little bit darker, but like also it's for kids, so I get why it's not super creepy, eerie, but there was some room. There were definitely some tales that I think we could have spent more time in or developed a little bit further. Overall, I liked all the changes and the twists that were made to the fairy tales. In some cases, I think it made them stronger, like the Peter Pan tale and the Red Riding Hood tale. Actually, Red Riding Hood reminds me very much of a poem that I wrote and had published when I was at Bridgewater, so I definitely had a little bit of a soft spot for that one. I loved the cultural representations and the different representations of experiences and lifestyles that were in this book. I found it really fantastic. I love the illustrations. Some of them are beautiful. For example, this is an illustration from Rapunzel. The illustrator on these is Julia Iredale. She did a fantastic job. There were some things, and this is very nitpicky of me, that I'd be reading this story and the illustration that corresponded with that moment of the story didn't exactly match what was written, which I picked up on, but I don't think most people would. For example, in the Bluebeard story, they're talking about how he goes down to this forbidden door that he's not supposed to go to, and he talks about how he's in like a bathrobe and has like a towel on his head because he's been pampering himself all morning. And in the illustration, he's like in a suit and like fully like dressed up like a prince. So it's just like those little inconsistencies I did pick up on, but I don't think that they take away from the reading experience at all. You're still getting illustrations that are beautiful. One character that I did not like to see illustrated is the devil in Rumpelstiltskin. This is nightmare fuel. Okay, Soman, what is that? Who Whoomst. That's terrifying. No child wants to see that ever. I as an adult don't want to see that. But overall, this was a great fast read, a great way to just have some escapism into these worlds of fairy tales. It made me want to get back to fairy tales so badly. It was a fast read. I could break it up into manageable chunks. I also think this is a book that I would keep around and like one day in the future leave on my kids' bookshelf in their playroom or whatever so they can explore fairy tales and see different versions. I think it's really, really cool to expose kids and to expose people to different versions of the same story. I'm a big fan of retellings. I love adapted versions and things like that. So this is one that I would definitely recommend. Especially I think this would be a really great fall read, right? When it's kind of like dark and creepy out, leaning towards Halloween. You need just like a little bit of a darker twist or a darker read. I think this would be great. I also think it pairs really well with winter time, honestly, when it's dark and desolate and kind of creepy and cold. You might find this on a nice like snowy dark night or cold chilly night. This might be a nice read to snuggle up with, and it moves really quickly. I think obviously adult readers can finish this in a couple of hours. Overall, I gave this book a 3.5 out of 5 stars. Again, some of them were a little bit short for me and some of them I just needed a little bit more. I liked the twists, but I also would just love to see more fairy tales. I think there could have been more. The Snow Queen would have been a fantastic tale to include in this collection. Just was left wanting a little bit more than I got here, but overall I think the illustrations and the stories themselves, the different representations and the twists that Soman Chainani made were fantastic. This is also part of a weekly reading vlog that I'm currently filming, so that should be up shortly, where I'm reading a couple of different books, but I did want to get on here and share my thoughts for Beasts and Beauty, Dangerous Tales. Like I said, I'm a big fan of retellings, specifically fairy tale retellings. So if you have any favorite fairy tale retellings, leave them for me in the comments down below. My favorites will be listed there for you as well. Let me know what you think. Have you read this? Do you want to read this? Do you like fairy tale retellings? What are your thoughts? Let me know. And we are going to leave a little red apple for Snow White in the comments as well today. That's the emoji of the day. That's all I have for you guys today. Thank you guys so much for watching this video. I hope you enjoyed it and enjoyed this review of Beasts and Beauty by Soman Chainani. I will see you guys in my next one and over on Instagram at RoyReadingCo, and I will see you in my next one.